the situation in Palestine. Dr. Finklestein is a renowned political scientist and one of the most widely recognized scholars of the Israeli-Palestine conflict. He received his PhD from Princeton University. Please keep clapping. I hear you guys clapping. And has spent decades researching and writing on international law, human rights, and the history of the conflict. For decades, Dr. Finklestein has been a leading voice calling for accountability, justice, and respect for international law. Tonight, we are honored to have him here with us to share his insights and perspective to discuss the situation on the ground under the umbrella of a ceasefire in name only. Please, round of applause for Dr. Norman Finklestein.
My time, unfortunately, is finite because I have to catch a plane this evening. So I'm going to try as best as I can to make efficient use of time and hopefully be informative. Obviously, people's minds are now preoccupied with events elsewhere than Gaza. But that being said, this is a fundraiser for Gaza, and I don't think it's right to so quickly move elsewhere in accordance with the news cycle and real events. It's not just the news cycle, but it never does harm to pause to recall what happened before, especially since we're in a very strange moment right now where if you look at human rights law and human rights organizations, the expression that's used to describe a genocide, it's called the crime of crimes. And if you look at what the U.S., the American prosecutor, had to say during the prosecutions of the leading Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg after World War II, the prosecutor, the American prosecutor, his name is Robert Jackson. He was in our U.S. Supreme Court, and he described aggression as the supreme international crime. So we have genocide being described as the crime of crimes, and we have aggression being described as the supreme international crime. And now what we're observing before our very eyes is that for roughly 2.5 years, and it's ongoing, Israel committed the crime of crimes in Gaza. It was enabled to commit the crime of crimes by the United States. And then, barely in the blink of an eye, it then launched, together with its chief enabler, the United States of America, it launched the supreme international crime, the crime of aggression against the Islamic State of Iran. There is really no precedent, at least since World War II, of such a sequence of events. The crime of crimes, and then the supreme crime. And notwithstanding, when you look at the UN Security Council, for example, the UN Security Council debates, with the exception of the Russian Confederation and China, nobody condemns Israel. Nobody condemns the US. And everybody condemns Iran. During the debates of the Security Council regarding what was happening in Gaza, there wasn't one resolution, not one, condemning the genocide in Gaza. And in the current round, one resolution passed condemning Iran for attacking the Gulf states, but no resolution condemning the US and Israel for launching the supreme international crime. I left off watching the Security Council deliberations when this representative from Denmark came on and with total presence of mind, total lucidity of mind, and with complete command and control of what she was saying, she devotes her remarks to condemning Iran. Nothing about the US. Nothing about Israel. Now, I don't want to sound prejudiced or biased in these matters, but I do think it's correct to say objectively, factually, that there is simply no case of a more brazen, flagrant violation of the UN Charter, in particular Article 2 of the UN Charter. There is simply no comparable case of a brazen, flagrant breach of the UN Charter than the US-Israel attack on Iran. That's just a fact. There is simply no dispute about that. There were cases in the past where you could say close call whether or not a state was guilty of aggression. There were cases in the past where you had serious debates about whether it was an aggression. For some of you who are old enough in this room, there were debates around Israel's attack on Egypt in 1967. There were debates in 2003 as to whether or not the U.S., when it launched its attack on Iraq, was guilty of an aggression. It took Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General, a long time. In fact, my memory is he had already left office when he was asked, my memory is, by a journalist, and he finally said, for those of you who are too young and you're excused, Kofi Annan was the Secretary General of the UN at the time of the U.S. attack on Iraq. He finally said it was an illegal war. He uttered the words very belatedly, but he uttered them. It's not even a debate. In this case, it's not a close call. there's no dispute. It was a brazen, flagrant breach of the UN Charter. And yet, you look at those UN Security Council debates, it's what the Russian representative said. He was referring to the E3 powers, Germany, the UK, and France. He said, to listen to them, it's like a parallel universe. How, in light of the sequence of events, can you be condemning Iran? That doesn't make any sense. He said, those of you who are familiar with the story of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, he said it's like you're through the looking glass. So strange, the times we're living in, that the perpetrators of the crime of crimes, the perpetrators of the supreme international crime, they get a free pass. And then you see, before the current events, which many of you, I suspect, are not entirely familiar with. And it's not long ago. It was just not reported. On November 17th, 2025, 5 months ago, there was a resolution passed in the United Nations Secretary of the Security Council. It was Resolution 2803. How many of you are familiar with it? Raise your hand. I'm just curious. Yeah, I'm not surprised. It was definitely the strangest resolution ever passed in the UN Security Council. Now, I know everybody uses that kind of language. Referring to the United States, our current Secretary of Defense, who prefers to call himself the Secretary of War, I personally would call him the Secretary of Hair Gel, but let's leave that aside. Our current Secretary of Defense, War, Hair Gel, every battle echoing that retarded ape in the White House, every battle is the biggest, most spectacular, the most incredible in the history of humankind. Of course, his memory of the history of humankind stretches all the way back to when he got up in the morning. If that far. But I do believe it's fair to say that it was the strangest resolution ever passed in the UN Security Council. In fact, it was so strange, so outrageous, that it was noticeable that the Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Guterres, he didn't even show up. He sent a subordinate of his. Now, I imagine many of you at this point are wondering, okay, what the heck was in that resolution? So, I said already, we live in these very strange times now. And I do not in the least want to underestimate the gravity of the times we're living in. I don't claim any special knowledge of the subject because it's mostly now on the military plane, not the political plane, and I have no special knowledge in military affairs. But for example, in the past couple of days, in what's called the meet and greet, where I talked to some people who purchased this, that, or the other book by me, I've had a chance to speak to several Iranians. And each of them I've asked, when they've walked up to me, well, what do you think? And each of them who knows their country, they were very grim. Because Iran is in for keeps. And it means we are living in very dangerous times right now. So I don't want to in any way diminish the gravity of the moment, but I do think it's a very strange moment of that famous adage about blaming the victim. Blaming the victim. To be blaming Iran for what happened 13 days ago. That's so weird. That's so bizarre. It really is the parallel universe. And now I return to that resolution. So weird, so bizarre what happened on November 17th. Since nobody knows and I don't fault you, how would you know? So there was this Security Council resolution, 2803. Anybody who follows UN resolutions, and that means enough people to fit in my bathroom at home, to follow UN resolutions, they usually begin, for those of you who are academics and will know, they begin with this huge preamble. The preamble, that means it comes before the resolution. It says, emphasizing this, affirming that, reaffirming this, noting that. The purpose of the preamble is to set forth the context for the issue we're currently debating today at the Security Council. And as if all of you understand for sure, there's a long history behind the Israel-Palestine conflict. Some people will trace it 100 years and more to the Balfour Declaration. Others will trace it back to 1947, the UN Partition Resolution. Others will trace it back to 1967, when Israel comes to occupy the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. But whichever point of demarcation you use, 1917, 1947, 1967, it's a long history. And it's embodied in a huge amount of international law. So, in the course of that span, I'll begin with 1947, the partition resolution. In the course of that period, from 1967 to the present, approximately 60 years, basic principles have been established. So, for example, the principle, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. You can't, under our current legal system, you can't acquire territory by war. Mr. Huckabee, the current UN ambassador to, you'll fix it, no problem. Yeah. One of the great questions is, how many Arab civil engineers does it take to fix a microphone? Okay. Mr. Huckabee, he was, when he was interviewed not too long ago by Tucker Carlson, Mr. Huckabee, whose gray matter can fit in a thimble with a lot of room left over, he kept saying, well, if you win territory in the war, you can keep it. No, Mr. Huckabee, really, it's no shame to be stupid, but it is a shame when you display it. Just shut up. It's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Basic principle of international law. And peoples have the right to self-determination. Very basic principle of international law. In the issue at hand, what does that mean? Number one, Israel has no right to the West Bank, no right to Gaza, no right to East Jerusalem. Those territories were conquered in the course of a war, the 1967 war, and therefore Israel has no legal title to those territories. Not one job, not 1 inch, no legal right to any of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem. That's the law. Number two, Palestinians constitute, under international law, they constitute a people. Under international law, a people has the right to self-determination and statehood. Number three, the Palestinians have the right to a state in the whole of the West Bank, the whole of Gaza, and including East Jerusalem. That's the law. Number four, Israel has been consistently in breach of international law in the occupied Palestinian territories by building settlements and doing all sorts of other things in order to annex the territories. So Israel has become an illegal occupier of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and so under international law, Israel has to leave. The expression by the International Court of Justice in July 2025 was they have to leave, quote, as rapidly as possible. Why do I mention all this? Some of you might be wondering. Because this remarkable UN resolution had no preamble. Do you know preambles to these? Because there are so many UN resolutions, so we have a lot of documents to look at. The preambles usually run, believe it or not, I'm not joking, I'm not exaggerating, they run to like 7 pages. Because there's so much law. So many UN resolutions. So many International Court of Justice advisory opinions. The whole history of the conflict vanished in this resolution. It no longer exists. For those of you who remember the days of typing before computers, there was a thing we used called whiteout. You put a brush inside a little bottle with white sort of paint in it, and you were able to wipe out errors you made in your written item. It was as if they took a whiteout to 65 years. It was breathtaking. What happened to the preamble? It was gone. Gaza, in this resolution, it was no longer occupied territory. That's a fact. For those of you who even followed the conflict from afar, from a distance, most of you will be familiar with the term occupied Palestinian territories, or they would use the abbreviation OPT, Occupied Palestinian Territory. That was a standard abbreviation. It was gone. Gaza was no longer occupied. In fact, Gaza was suspended in a legal limbo. It no longer had any connection with the West Bank. It was just this place called Gaza. It wasn't occupied. It had no connection with the West Bank. It had no connection to any space on the map. They just threw in this place called Gaza in the resolution and not defining what is it? Where did it come from? What's its legal status? It was all gone. Gaza became what's known as in international law as a res, R-E-S, new word, nullius, N-U-L-L-I-U-S. That's the Latin. And the term goes back to the late 19th century when the Europeans conquered Africa. So, how do you justify carving up a continent called Africa? How do you justify it? You have to have a legal justification. And the legal justification they came up with was res nullius. And that just means belongs to nobody. Africa belonged to nobody. And now Gaza became res nullius. Gaza belonged to nobody. Unfortunately, that's the best part of the resolution. Because the next step was to award it to somebody. And that's exactly what the resolution did. It awarded Gaza to Donald J. Trump. That's a fact, folks. God, for those of you who remember the board game Monopoly, raise your hand if you remember the board game Monopoly. That little deed to Boardwalk Park Place, the purple properties, the red properties, they gave the deed of Gaza to Donald J. Trump personally. I know you're thinking, that can't be true. That can't be true. It can't be possible. Well, it happened. They created what they called a board of peace. A board of peace. And they made Donald Trump the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer of the Board of Peace. The Board of Peace had, according to the resolution, no checks, no limits on his power, either internally or externally. What does that mean? Nobody within the Board of Peace has any check over Donald Trump's power. That's in the UN resolution. And then, as the Board of Peace, after the UN resolution, after the Board of Peace was formally created, Donald J. Trump has veto power. He has veto power over any and every decision taken by the Board of Peace. He has absolute and total power. I will say unequivocally, Donald J. Trump, as of November 17th, 2025, he owns Gaza. That's what the UN Security Council did. It awarded the deed of Gaza to the Trump Organization in New York City. That's what it did. The only demand, and it wasn't a demand, it was a request. The only request put on Trump, the retarded ape in the White House, the only request put on him, the only request was he had to submit every 6 months a report, and I have to be careful because the UN is very careful about language. I said he had to submit. That's not correct. They requested. No, it's a very big difference. The UN is very cautious about language. It's very legalese. The only limit on Trump's power was they requested that every 6 months he submit a report of what's unfolding in Gaza. That's it. He has total veto power over any decision made in the Board of Peace. He can veto anything and everything. And the UN Security Council, the only limit they placed on his power was a request every 6 months to submit a report on what's going on. The Board of Peace was supposed to facilitate humanitarian aid to Gaza and reconstruction in Gaza. Of two things, I think we can say, based on the track record, not on one's wishes, but on this track record, two things will not happen in Gaza. Number one, Israel will never admit humanitarian aid beyond a bare minimum. It's not going to happen. Why? Very simple. Not difficult to figure out. Because, first of all, Israel, since its occupation of Gaza, and in particular, since 2006, when Hamas was elected into power in what was the first free and fair election in the modern Arab world. Some people say actually Tunisia preceded it. I'm not going to argue, but it's usually described, the elections in January 2006, it's usually described as the first fair and free elections in the Arab world, the parliamentary elections in the West Bank and Gaza. Immediately as Hamas won the election, which incidentally was monitored by U.S. President Jimmy Carter, and Carter, who was there at the time, he said elections were full and free, can't be disputed. Not that he wanted to dispute them. Once Carter left office, he was not a bad guy. In office, a disaster, unfortunately, but after he left office, he was not a bad guy. Actually, I felt he was a very decent guy. In any event, immediately as Hamas won the election, Israel imposed this brutal blockade on Gaza. Gaza, even before, was not an easy place to live. From 1948, when approximately 300,000 Palestinians expelled from the newly formed state of Israel ended up in Gaza. From that point on, it's been a very harsh place. If you go back and read the history, one observer after another, from the outside coming in, the image you find that recurs over and over again. The first main UN representative in Gaza. Bear in mind, I'm talking now, I said from right after 1948. Gaza at that point was under Egyptian rule. Egyptian rule. The UN representative, he says, you don't see starving people in the street, that's true, but it's a concentration camp. That's what he said. After Israel occupies Gaza in 1967, a senator goes to visit Gaza, Senator Gore, not the Gore who ran for president, but his father. He comes back, he goes to Congress, and he describes Gaza as, quote, a concentration camp on the sand, if you will. Those are his words. Concentration camp on the sand. In 2004, Giora Eiland, the head of Israel's National Security Council, he goes to visit Gaza with some U.S. representatives. How does he describe Gaza? He says Gaza is, quote, a huge concentration camp. Bear in mind, I will repeat, those words come to you from the head of Israel's National Security Council. he knows Gaza. He happens to be an extreme right-wing fanatic, and he certainly understands the resonance of using the descriptive concentration camp. Yet, we have it in the email. You can go look at it yourself if you're interested. Just Google Giora, Giora, Island, E-I-L-A-N-D, March 2004. It says Gaza is a huge concentration camp. Now, everything I just said in the past few minutes was before the blockade. When Israel imposes the blockade on Gaza, it prohibits everything from going into Gaza. Chocolate, banned. Baby chips, banned. Potato chips, banned. Coriander, banned. Paper, banned. Why? They were very straightforward about it. They said, we're going to put the people of Gaza on a humanitarian minimum. That's the expression they used. A humanitarian minimum. It was so, I'm sorry I have to use the word, but the situation warrants it. It was so diabolical. So diabolical that, again, this will sound strange, weird. They calculated the caloric intake. They calculated the caloric intake of the people of Gaza and admitted only enough calories to keep the population at a humanitarian minimum, which is just a euphemistic way of saying to keep the people of Gaza on a starvation plus diet. That's what happened. Now, I don't want to lose sight of where I was, because I was saying they will never admit more than the humanitarian minimum or a starvation plus diet in Gaza. And probably my opinion is a lot less. Why? Because beginning on October 8th, Israel had resolved that it was going to once and forever solve the Gaza question. It was no longer going to be, as Israel called it, we're not going to mow the lawn anymore in Gaza. Mow the lawn referred to these periodic, high-tech killing sprees in Gaza. Some of you will remember some of the names: Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, Operation Pillar of Defense 2012, Operation Protective Edge 2014. Those were mowings of the lawn. And Israel resolved after October 8th, no more mowing the lawn in Gaza. We are going to solve the Gaza question once and for all. And that meant, instead of cutting the grass in Gaza, we are going to pull each blade of grass, half of them being children. We're going to pull each blade of grass out. The fancy word is, when you pull something out by the roots, it's called to extirpate it. and they're going to extirpate every blade of grass in Gaza. That is, we're going to empty it out. Come what may, do what it requires, the Gaza question is going to be solved. That was item number 1 on the Israeli agenda beginning October 8th. And they made very clear there was no ambiguity in their intention. Be it the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who said to the Israeli soldiers, remember Amalek, which meant you kill every man, woman, and child. Remember Amalek. It was made clear by the defense minister, who said, we will not admit any food, water, fuel, or electricity into Gaza. It was made clear, that was Defense Minister Galon. It was made clear by the President, Herzog. He said there are no innocents in Gaza. This notion of Gazans versus Hamas, he said that's false. There are no innocents. Now, some people said he was just saying, they were only saying this because it was the heat of the moment. They were so traumatized, so shocked. But the irony is, if it isn't irony, not sure that's the right word, if you look back after 2.5 years, everything they said they were going to do, that's exactly what they did. They were determined, of course there are constraints imposed by the international community, feeble for sure, weak for sure, but there are some constraints. They did a very effective job. By every metric, what happened in Gaza, there was no parallel. Not only some people start dating it from 2000, even in terms of the density of the bombing of Gaza, there was actually no parallel going back as far as World War II. The most famous bombings during World War II, the worst war crimes, places like Dresden, the density of bombing was more intense in Gaza. It was. Number of medics killed, number of journalists killed, number of UN workers killed, absolute number of children killed, absolute number of women killed, ratio of civilians to combatants killed. In all those categories, Israel was completely off the charts. Even if you compare it to places like Syria, the worst year in Syria, if my memory is correct, was 2016. There were more children killed in Gaza in the first 4 weeks, or as many in the first 4 weeks as in Syria in a year. It was off the charts. Now, for various reasons, which time doesn't allow me to go into, President Trump, the retarded ape, pulled the plug on with the ceasefire resolution. However, Israel is not about to give up on its objective number 1, to solve the Gaza question. And you saw it. What was the first thing they did? What was the first thing they did after launching the aggression against Iran? The first thing they did was block any humanitarian aid from going into Gaza. Now, again, the U.S. put some pressure, so they had to lift that total blockade again. They announced a total blockade on any humanitarian aid from entering Gaza. They've not let go of that goal. And there's no possibility whatsoever, none, that the humanitarian aid admitted to Gaza will ever, so long as Israel's in charge, will approach what's needed there now. The second thing in this UN resolution, they said, we're going to reconstruct Gaza. Reconstruction. Number one, it can't happen. It can. I know that's a painful thing to have to sink in. The magnitude of damage in Gaza is 60 million tons of rubble. 60 million tons of rubble. Obviously, few with any minds is sufficiently capacious, that means has the capacity to conceive 60 million tons of rubble. The estimates are at minimum, just to clear out the rubble, which is not an easy task, because it's mixed in with toxic substances, it's mixed in with unexploded ordnance, and of course, it's mixed in with a lot of dead bodies. They say it would take a minimum of 15 years. I'm not talking about reconstruction. I'm talking about just clearing out the rubble. Reconstruction based on the past experience with Israel in those various high-tech killing sprees, Cast Lead, Protected Edge. They said reconstruction would take a minimum of 8 decades. 8 decades. These are the estimates of the most reputable international humanitarian organizations. Then, this resolution creates for Gaza an international stabilization force. The International Stabilization Force, it's supposed to demilitarize Gaza. Demilitarize Gaza. Another of those strange, bizarre elements in this resolution. Why does Gaza have to be demilitarized? Okay, you could say because of the horrors of October 7th. Okay, fine. The estimate is 36 children, for example, were killed on October 7th. 36. So Gaza, 36 Israeli children were killed on October 7th, so Gaza has to be demilitarized. At minimum, at this point, 36,000 Palestinian children were killed. So why doesn't Israel have to be demilitarized? What sense does that make? Even the human rights organizations that are toughest on Hamas, they accuse Hamas of having committed war crimes, which I believe is accurate. They accuse Hamas of committing crimes against humanity. I think there's a case there. But nobody accuses Hamas of having committed genocide. On the other hand, UN Commission of Inquiry, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, leading Holocaust scholar organizations. There's a broad consensus. Israel committed genocide. So that's correct. Why is it that the state that committed the crime of crimes is not obliged to demilitarize, but Israel is obliged to demilitarize? What does the resolution say about the future of Gaza? The future of Gaza, the future of the West Bank, the future of East Jerusalem, occupied Palestinian territories, though the resolution doesn't say that. I'm just saying what the law says, or did say until November 17th, 2025. It says the following: before there can be any political solution in Gaza and elsewhere, West Bank and East Jerusalem, number one, the Palestinian, 2 minutes? Well, I'm just going to, then because it's only 2 minutes, I'll simply say the resolution states that Israel does not have to withdraw from Gaza until it's ready to. Israel can stay there in perpetuity. And the resolution says that any political solution to the situation in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, any political solution has to be agreed to by Israel. Not international law any longer, but Israel has a veto power over any solution to the Gaza, or broadly speaking, Palestine question. And having said that, some of you may wonder, which is a legitimate wonder, why didn't the Russians and the Chinese, why didn't they veto the resolution? And here's a story to tell. Unfortunately, I can't go through the details, but the broad picture you will completely grasp. The Russians and the Chinese faced a dilemma. The dilemma was this: all the Arab and Muslim countries supported the resolution. Algeria supported the resolution. Egypt supported the resolution. Jordan supported the resolution. Pakistan supported the resolution. Qatar supported the resolution. Saudi Arabia supported the resolution. Turkey supported the resolution. The UAE supported the resolution. In fact, the state of Palestine supported the resolution. And the Russians and the Chinese said, you know the expression, not being more pious than the Pope. If all the Arab and Muslim states support the resolution, how can we, meaning the Russians and the Chinese, how can we veto it? The Russians said in their statement, this was a black day in the history of the UN. And their last line was, don't say we didn't warn you. Don't say we didn't warn you. And now I will leave off by saying, when Iran attacked Qatar, when Iran attacked the UAE, when Iran attacked Saudi Arabia, I said to myself, what goes around comes around. The very first act of the Arab states after the U.S.-Israeli aggression against Iran, the supreme international crime, their first act was they announced we're going to increase the oil supply so as to enable that aggression against Iran. And I thought to myself, you enable the aggression against Iran by increasing the oil supply. Did you decrease the oil supply when Gaza was going through its martyrdom? You increase it for the U.S. and Israel to commit aggression against Iran. Did you decrease it when Gaza was suffering through its martyrdom? What goes round comes round.
Round of applause for Dr. Norman Finklestein. Please have a seat. We're going to do Q&A with you now. So much knowledge, so little time. Once again,